When my brother was in college, he was taking a class that allowed him to do a cultural immersion study along with one of his peers in college. So my brother Caleb and his friend Adam went to this village. It happened to be this village in Tanzania where they spent a few days living with this group of people. And that was a new experience for him, even though he had grown up in Tanzania. This was something that he had never done, to actually just stay with this family for a few days. And this was totally new to his friend Adam as well. And as he went to this village was really excited to have these two American boys walking around, and they said, hey, this is great. Let's give these guys a tour of our village, all right? So they're taking all these guys all over the place. They're the tourists here in this village, and they're excited to show them around. Now, as is often the case in many villages in Tanzania, there's often one or a few witch doctors in every village. And what a witch doctor is it's basically a male sorcerer, all right? And that's their occupation is people come to this person and they either cast spells or they heal them, and they do all these sort of things to help people out, all right? And it just so happened that this particular village had a witch doctor with quite a reputation, all right? So people came from miles around, and this witch doctor was considerably wealthy, so he had a home in the center of the village that was nicer than all the rest of the homes around. So naturally, if you're getting a tour of the village, this is the main attraction, all right? So they're taking them to the village, and just so happened the witch doctor happened to be home. And he invited, here's these two American young boys. Let's invite them into my house. So they get invited into this person's home, and he starts showing them all around all these different things. And he showed them this particular item that he had, this well-decorated gourd. And this gourd had, on one side of it, it had some money attached to it. On the other side of it, it had a mirror. And this witch doctor, maybe to show off, maybe to scare them or whatever, he says to them, he says, but don't look into this mirror. Because if you look into this mirror, it'll take your soul or something of that nature. My brother, when I was asking him for the details yesterday of refreshing the story, he's like, I'm not quite sure what he said, but he was really trying to scare us. Don't look into the mirror were his instructions. So it'll do bad things to you. And my brother, really without even thinking, responded, no, it can't. A little surprised at his statement, and then suddenly realizing that he had just challenged this witch doctor, my brother began to explain, well, you see, I am a Christian. And really those things have no power over me. I know who holds my soul. And as he started thinking about this, he began to say, you know what, man, I just challenged this witch doctor. And he turned to his friend who was next to him, Adam. He says, who really had no idea what has just taken place, because he's not speaking Swahili, and he has no idea. My brother turns to him and says, I think I just challenged this witch doctor. Pray for me. And so Adam starts praying for my brother, and then my brother starts saying, well, what do I do now? Well, let me just start sharing the gospel with this individual. So my brother starts talking to this person, and by this time he hadn't been living in Tanzania for a number of years, so his Swahili's a little bit rusty, and he's sharing the gospel, and he's trying to think of these verses to share, and as he's thinking them in English, all of a sudden he's able to translate them really quickly into Swahili, and he's like, how am I able to do this? And he is excited that these passages are coming to him as he's sharing the gospel with this witch doctor. And after that, the witch doctors are, okay, listens to what my brother has to say, and then sort of sends them on their way. All right? And the pastor, who happened to be one of the tour guides, left that going, whoa, that was exciting. Wow, did you see what just happened? I mean, boy, you don't know this, but this guy has quite a reputation, He does these things, he does all these sorts of things, and wow, that was cool. You just challenged this witch doctor. And I tell that story because I'm sure you can all relate to, no, I'm just joking. No, but, and most likely, many of us have never challenged the witch doctor before, or even been put in a situation where challenging a witch doctor is even possible. But the reason I tell this story is because God puts us in situations over and over again where we have opportunities to prove our God to be trustworthy. And we may think, well, what sorts of scenarios does God give me? You know, and maybe it's something along the lines where you're scared of something. You're feeling vulnerable. Maybe there's a health struggle. Maybe there's a marriage conflict. Maybe there's kids that are rebelling. Maybe you don't know what the future holds. Maybe there's an investment that went out the window. Maybe you lost your job. There can be all sorts of scenarios that we are given, and all these are actually opportunities to prove our God is trustworthy. And today, as we continue on in our series of Moses, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking mainly at Numbers chapter 20. But we're going to look at some other passages as well. And what we're going to find in these three scenarios, and it just so happens that a similar thing happens three times, and conveniently we've skipped over the first two, and we're looking at the third one, but we're going to jump back and look at the other examples from Moses' life here. But what we're going to see is that Moses was also given opportunities to prove God as trustworthy. And God desires that we prove him as trustworthy. Now, how? That's the question. How does God use us to prove him as trustworthy? Well, I'd like you to go ahead and turn in your Bibles first to Exodus chapter 15. Exodus chapter 15, verse 22. And what we're going to find in this verse, in the next couple verses we're going to read as well, is that God puts us in situations that we cannot handle by ourselves. How does God prove himself as trustworthy? He puts us in situations where we cannot handle it by ourselves. And in Moses' situations, we're going to start first here in chapter 15, and starting in verse 22. This is what we read. Moses led the people from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. And that is why the place is called Marah, which means bitter. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" So this first scenario, they're out in the desert of Shur, and they're unable to find water, and all they have for water is this bitter water that they can't drink. So these people are dying of thirst, and they're grumbling to Moses, saying, what are we supposed to drink? This water is undrinkable. Turn with me as well to Exodus chapter 17, verses 1 through 3, where we have a similar situation happening. This time they aren't in the desert of Shur, they're in another desert, the desert of Sin. Now, the great thing about the desert of Sin is there's no bad things happening there because it's a desert of... Okay, that's a terrible joke. I'm sorry I said it. I'll leave those bad jokes. I got it out of my system. Okay, all right, Exodus chapter 17, starting in verse 1. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord had commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to make us and our children live and livestock die of thirst?" Again, a similar situation. No water to drink in the desert of Sin. And then we switch to a third scenario here in Numbers chapter 20, verses 2 through 5. And this time they're in another desert. This is the desert of Zin. All right, so we have Numbers chapter 20, starting in verse 1. It says, "In the first month, the whole Israelite community arrived at the desert of Zin and stayed in Kadesh. There Miriam died and was buried. Now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. And they quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into the wilderness so that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs or grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. All right, so we see this similar scenario happening 3 times in Moses' life, all right? Again and again, he's finding himself in this place there where God has led the nation of Israel. Because remember, who's leading them through the desert? We have this column of, this cloud of this column of cloud that's leading them through the desert. So God is directing them exactly to where he wants them to go. And over again, he's directing them to places where there's no water. So God's bringing them to these places. He's bringing them to these scenarios where they are unable to handle it by themselves. And here we have Moses in each of these 3 scenarios, and the people are ticked at him. They're grumbling against him, saying, why don't we have any water? And yet, here are opportunities to prove God as trustworthy. Now, our situations usually aren't quite the same. Our situations usually don't have to do with us not having any water and us being grumbled towards to say, hey, we need water. Our situations can be a little bit different, but similar to Moses, our situations are very challenging, and they show that we cannot handle things by ourselves. Sometimes our situations can come upon us suddenly or gradually. You know, sometimes it's a sudden, unexpected event. Maybe there's a loss in the family. Maybe, like we said earlier, maybe there's a job that disappears. Maybe there's investments that disappear. They can be things that are completely outside of our control that happen. Those can be opportunities that God brings. Sometimes they're unexpected things that really should have been obvious to us, but we were oblivious to the fact that they were happening. You know, sometimes it can be things such as a marriage that's falling apart, that all of a sudden we're like, whoa, how did this happen? When really, maybe we should have been seeing the signs all along that this was happening, but all of a sudden it comes upon us. Maybe there's a bad habit that causes some health concern. Maybe sometimes there's a vice that all of a sudden becomes public, and we go, whoa, I never expected that to happen, when really all along there were actions leading towards that becoming public. But whatever situation, sometimes these things come upon us suddenly, these situations. And other times, it's more gradual. Other times, we fight it tooth and nail. We say, I can handle this on my own. I've got this. I mean, this scenario, okay, it's not working right now, but maybe if I put a little bit more effort into it, then I'll take care of it. I can handle on my own. And sometimes it's a long, gradual process before we finally admit that God has us in a place that we cannot handle on our own. You know, one obvious example I think of is the fact that if you're a Christian here this morning, and even if you're not a Christian here this morning, you know, this is the story in our lives as believers. This is our story where we finally come to a point. Maybe sometimes it's a long battle against us. Maybe sometimes it's a shorter battle against us. But we finally come to a point to say, hey, I can't do enough good things to save myself. I can't be a good enough person. I can't do these things. I'm not worthy to be in God's presence. And we finally admit, God, I can't do this on my own. That's our condition. And sometimes it takes us, it's a gradual process to finally arrive at a point where we recognize that we cannot handle it on our own. Maybe sometimes it's the realization that we can't raise our kids the way that we were expecting, that we need God's help. And God, I cannot do this on my own. Sometimes it's struggling to help and convince someone that really the gospel is true. And we say, man, hey, I think I can handle this on my own. And God shows us over and over again and says, no, you cannot handle it. You need me in these situations. And these situations happen at any point in our lives. These situations can begin at any point. These things don't just happen when we are young. These situations don't just happen when we are older. These situations can appear at any point in our lives. You know, I think sometimes we as Christians, and we look at these situations that we can't handle by ourselves, and we wish that we would reach a point in our maturity where we don't have to worry about those before, right? It's like, this is a scary situation I can't handle on my own, and someday I'll reach a point of maturity where I'll be safe and secure finally I can handle this, you know. But no. God brings these things into our lives at all different points, and it shows us over and over again that we need God. We cannot handle these situations by ourselves. You know, I even think of this last scenario here in Numbers 20. You know how old Moses is in Numbers 20 at this third event where they are without water. The first time he was around 80 years old. The first two times he's around 80 years old. Here in this third time, when God brings him to the place where he's in a situation where there's no water and he can't handle it by himself, he is over 120 years old at this point. I mean, Moses was well aware of the fact when he comes in a situation that, boy, this can happen at any point. It's not something that I grow out of. God brings these situations into our lives at any point in our lives, and then we are come face to face with the fact that we cannot handle this situation by ourselves. And also, another thing about our situations is they can occur multiple times. I mean, look at Moses. 3 times. Same situation. No water to drink. Another time, what's the situation? No water to drink. A third time, what's the situation? No water to drink. And you almost imagine Moses going, God, I already learned this lesson. I mean, why are you bringing me back to this again? God, I thought I learned this. I mean, can't we move on to other things? Can't I learn the lesson in each area of my life and then I'll be done with this? And yet here we have Moses learning this lesson again and again, being put in the same scenario as before. And sometimes in our lives we can think, oh man, okay, I learned this lesson about my marriage. I learned this lesson in relation to my finances that I need. I learned this in relation to my job. I learned it in relation to my health. I learned it in relation to my kids. And why do I keep learning these lessons where I'm put in situations where I cannot handle it by myself? I think of one particular family reunion that I had with my dad's side of the family. And as we're gathering around, we had this time where we were sharing what God had been doing in our lives that year. And I was sharing that God had taught me a lesson that I was going to hold on to for the rest of my life. I was sharing this in high school. Okay, I'm sharing this, that I'm going to hold on to this the rest of my life. And my uncle, who was about to go next, had the same lesson. And he said, Zach, be ready. You're going to learn that lesson again. God has a way of teaching us that same lesson over and over and over again in our lives because we have our memories, we tend to forget. We tend to think that all of a sudden, okay, God took care of that, and all of a sudden we get back in this place where we go, okay, I can handle this by myself again, and God puts us back in that same place. We're forced to learn the same lesson again. And even though it can be no fun, God does this so that we turn to Him and not ourselves in these scenarios. I have a great author named David Burnham, and he gives a great quote in relation to this. He says, if you're feeling underqualified and overwhelmed, then that's when you're right where God wants you. If you're feeling underqualified and overwhelmed, then that's when you're right where God wants you. That's when you turn to Him and not yourself for results. But thankfully on this journey, how God uses us to prove Him trustworthy, He doesn't just end there. He doesn't just put us in situations that we can't handle by ourselves. He does more. God then takes that and gives us solutions that won't work without Him. All right? And this is what we find if we turn back to our passages. Go ahead and turn back with me to Exodus chapter 15. Exodus chapter 15, and let's look again at Moses' scenario here in the desert of Shur. All right? Here are the solutions that God gives to Moses. Exodus chapter 15, starting in verse 25. Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. And we look at that and we go, a piece of wood. And when we look at this piece of wood, what we need to realize is that this solution won't work without God. You know, I don't know too many people who, when they get to a place where there's bitter water or salt water, say, hey, go find a stick. And they grab the stick and they chuck it in, and all of a sudden we have drinking water. No. I mean, people don't do that because really that scenario that Moses was in, would not work unless God made that work, all right? These solutions don't work without God, all right? We also, if we flip over, Exodus chapter 17, the next scenario there. Exodus chapter 17, verses 4 through 6. Look at the solution that God gives Moses here. Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They are already ready to stone me." The Lord answers Moses, "Go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." Again, something that required God to intervene and do if it was going to work. Have you ever hit a stick? You ever hit a rock with a stick before? Anyone going to admit that? I have. I've done that. And what happened? The stick broke. Yeah. For me, nothing happened. And you go, oh, well, obviously nothing happened, Zach, because that solution won't work unless God makes it happen. It won't work without God. And the same is true with Moses here in this scenario. Why does it work? Why does the solution work? Because God was in it. Again, Numbers chapter 20. See this third time that God gives a solution. Numbers 20, verses 6 through 8. Says, Moses and Aaron went off from the assembly by the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell face down. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord said to Moses, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gathered the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. And you will bring water out of the rock for the community, so they and their livestock can drink." Now, I'm not even going to ask if anyone's ever tried that before, because it's really obvious. That would not work unless God were to intervene in that scenario. For water to come out of the rock simply by speaking to it. And although God probably hasn't placed you in a scenario where he's given you that solution before, I'm feeling very confidently safe in saying that, our solutions can have similar characteristics. See, our solutions, like Moses' solution, oftentimes require us to risk our reputation. Look at this. Each time that Moses goes before the people, each time that God gives him a solution, what is he supposed to do? He gathers people around. He's supposed to gather these elders around. He's supposed to gather these people around, and they're supposed to watch him do it. And you picture him bringing it around and almost like a little bit of sweat on Moses' forehead. He's thinking, okay, God, I hope you actually do this here, you know. This could be pretty embarrassing. You gather them all around, and he throws the stick in, and they go, "Nice throw. And where's our water?" And they take, I gather you. I don't know why I gathered you all around. Go ahead and go back. You know, and the same thing with hitting the rock with a stick. It required God to intervene, and it was an actual risk to Moses' reputation. If nothing happened, what happened? He's embarrassed. He's stuck, and then people get, man, that guy's a little bit crazy over there. You know, what's he even thinking? What's he doing? Over and over again, it had potential to be a risk to his reputation. And the same thing is true when we're looking at the solutions that God gives us. They're a risk to our reputations. You know, for example, I can look in the Word, and I can see that in Ephesians 5:33, God tells me as a husband to love my wife unconditionally. And I can look at that, I can read that, and I can say, well, unconditionally? Well, you mean even if she's being unlovable, I still got to love her? And we can look at those scenarios and we go, boy, well, what if this person takes advantage of that? What if they do all sorts of hurtful things to me? I mean, what if this person becomes even more unlovable? And I continue to love them unconditionally, and they're getting the good end of the deal, and I'm getting the raw end of the deal over here. And we can look at that, and maybe the friends say, hey, you're crazy. You're crazy, man. You're just opening yourself up to get hurt. I mean, you got to treat her the way that she's treating you. Otherwise, you know, she'll take advantage of that. And also it says in Ephesians 5:33, it talks about wives respecting their husbands unconditionally. But the same thing can be true there. I mean, what if your husband is being just a guy who's not respectable? And you're supposed to respect him unconditionally? I mean, what if you're in a conflict? What if he takes advantage of that? What if he doesn't even realize that you're not being treated well? And he just thinks everything's great in this marriage. Boy, she really respects me. I must be doing a great job. What if you turn into like a mat to be stepped upon because you're respecting this guy unconditionally, and all the friends say you're crazy. You're just opening yourself up to get hurt. And we look at these things, and they can be a risk to our reputation when we look at God's solutions, but when God shows up, those things work. But in the world's eyes, they're scary. In the world's eyes, we come to those, and they can be a risk to our reputation. And the thing is, these solutions that God gives us, even though they're embarrassing, if God doesn't show up and act, they're worth it because they build God's reputation. Another quote from David Burnham, he says, "You can't build God's reputation if you aren't willing to risk yours." Think about it. How does God use us to prove Him trustworthy? He gives us solutions that will not work without Him. So that who do we look towards? Who gets the credit? Our powerful God. Another thing about the solutions that God gives us is they're not always the same as last time. I mean, look at Moses. He doesn't find himself in the same scenario each time. He's not throwing a stick into bitter water each time he gets to these places, is he? He's given a different scenario each time. The first time God says, okay, throw a stick in the bitter water. Next time, hit this rock with your staff. Next time, speak to the rock. And each time is a different scenario. I mean, what would happen if he were just to throw the stick in each time to bitter water? I mean, Moses might begin to think that, actually, you know what? You know what's doing this? It's the stick. And anytime you come around bitter water, what you just do is you chuck a stick in there and it solves everything. And begin to start thinking that the solution to the problem is this method. And to stop realizing that, no, it's not the method. It's the God who asked you to do that. That's who's taking care of it each time. And even in our own lives, we can come to situations and we can begin to think, well, all right, I just got to plug this into the equation. I'm in a bad scenario. Here's the solution. That solves it. And we begin to take God and put Him on the shelf, and we begin to handle it by ourselves. And no longer is it a solution that doesn't work without Him. It's a solution that we think just works. You know, I think about Peter's sleeping habits these days. And we thought we had him nailed down several weeks ago. We thought, we got this guy figured out. We know how to get him to sleep. And then he changes. Man. And now he's a lot harder to get this. And now we're stuck. And we got to figure out, all right, this is not the same solution as before. And I know from talking to you who have been parents a lot longer, you say, well, you just wait. That's not the end of that sort of thing. And then God's going to give you another child who's totally different than this guy. And then you're going to have then you have teenagers, and then you're stuck. You're going to realize that the same solution really doesn't come up again. All right. So, but why does God do that? Why would God not allow us to just have the same solution each time? Because God wants us to continue to come back to Him over and over again to say, God, you are the one that makes this happen. God, I am trusting in you. God, I'm trusting in the solution you gave me. And God, I need you. I am dependent upon you. And sometimes our solutions as well may require more trust than before. Isn't it interesting that each time God asked Moses to do something, He used less and less? First time, there's water there, but it's bitter. Throw the stick in and it becomes fresh, drinkable water. Next time, there's a rock there, and I want you to hit it with your staff, and water will come out. The third time, there's a rock there. No, you aren't hitting it. You're just talking to it. That gets scarier and scarier, doesn't it? Requires more and more trust. And I look at Moses, and even the third time, I think, boy, that'd be scary. I mean, at least I'm hitting the rock with something, and now I'm just speaking to it. I mean, less and less each time. And, and I haven't been around long enough to know if God continues to do that same thing in our life where he uses less and less resources. And maybe some of you have charted out your life to a point where you go, oh, yeah, yep, see, there. Yeah. Most of the time, we don't have quite the same scenario that Moses had. But I think in our lives as well, even if God isn't using less and less resources, he may be requiring more and more trust than before. Even by the fact that we move into different seasons of life, where you have less time to recover if something goes awry. I mean, I think about if I'm taking a job when I'm fresh out of high school, I don't, whatever it ends up being, I've taken some bad jobs at the beginning, and whatever, I'm there for a little bit and I move on, all right? But later on in life, you get stuck in a job and you're just like, well, how do I recover from this? Things become more risky further on in life and may require more trust than before, even if it's the exact same scenario. So I think that in our lives, God is constantly bringing us solutions that require us to trust him more and more so that we depend upon him for the outcomes, so that he uses those to prove himself as trustworthy in our lives. And then after that, after we are depending upon God for the outcome, that is when God proves himself. That is when God does these incredible things. And turn back with me to Exodus chapter 15 as we see what happens here. Exodus chapter 15, verse 25. Hopefully you had your fingers in these things knowing I was coming back to them. But Exodus chapter 15, verse 25, Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. And he threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. Exodus chapter 17, verse 6. I'm going to rewind back to verse 5. Exodus 17, verse 5. The Lord answered Moses, "Go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you at the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and the water will come out of it for people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel, and they had water to drink. The proof in Moses' life and the proof in our lives can maybe look a little bit different, but it has some of the same characteristics. And your life, it may not look like a miracle to others, as we have in these scenarios here with Moses. It may just be that God changes your heart, restores your marriage, brings you a peace that you have never known before, calms an anger issue, gives forgiveness that you did not think was possible. And even if it doesn't defy the laws of physics, that doesn't make it any less than the fingerprint of God's working upon your life. And when that happens, when God does these incredible, powerful things in your life, even if it doesn't look like a miracle, it's proof in our lives that God is trustworthy. Another thing is that it honors God. Each time Moses believes in God's solution and God shows himself powerful to the nation of Israel, each time he did that, it was honoring to God. It showed the people around that look at this powerful God. Look at what he's doing. Look at how he is providing for the nation of Israel in the desert, and the reputation of God continues to be expanded. I was just amazed as I was sitting here thinking this morning about the God who we serve and the reputation that he has, and the fact that he allows us to have a part in proving him to be trustworthy. I mean, God, how is it that the all-knowing, all-powerful, almighty God can be honored by that? It's just amazing to me that God uses us to honor himself with the proof in our lives. And the third thing we find in the proof in our lives is that it affirms our confidence as well in God. Oftentimes we know intellectually that God is all-powerful, all-patient, holy, and all these things. But when he shows us through these experiences that those things are true, that affirms all the more what we already know to be true about God. The song, "'Tis So Sweet to Trust in Jesus." was written by Louisa Stead. And if you knew her story, you'd know that she started off life, and then she was married to this husband, and they had a daughter. And one day they went out for a picnic. And as they were sitting down for the picnic, eating next to a body of water near New York, as they're sitting there eating, what they heard was they heard the cry of someone drowning in the water. So Louisa's husband got up and rushed into the water to go save this young boy. And as she and her daughter washed from shore, both of these two individuals drowned. This made a very difficult life for Louisa and her daughter as they struggled to keep food on the table. And yet God continued to provide for their needs. And so then one day in 1882, she took pen to paper and wrote, "'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus." She saw in her life, and her confidence was affirmed in the God who she was worshiping. And God brings us into these situations that we cannot handle by ourselves. He gives us solutions that cannot work without Him, and He proves Himself to continue to affirm our confidence in God so that we trust Him more. But sad to say, and if you're familiar with the story of Moses, you know that that is not where Moses' story ends. In Numbers chapter 20, verses 10 through 11, we see that this last time Moses does something different than the times before. Starting in verse 9 of Numbers chapter 20, it says, "So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence just as he had commanded him. And he and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, 'Listen, you rebels. Must we bring you water out of this rock?'" I think it's interesting that already Moses is saying, "Must we?" as if he is a significant factor in this at all. And Moses raised his staff and struck the rock twice with his staff, and water gushed out. And the community and the livestock drank. You know, I wonder if at that point Moses looked and said, "Boy, all right, they're drinking. Glad to be out of that scenario." I wonder if he thought he was out of the woods for a minute. Until God comes to him again. This says in verse 12, "But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land that I give him." And I look at Moses, and I think about the consequence that he suffered here, the reward that he missed because he did not trust God enough to speak to the rock. And I think about Moses as he's led the people of Israel out of Egypt into the wilderness, telling them, "We're going to the promised land," and spending 40 years in the wilderness, waiting, longing to bring these people into the promised land. And as he gets right near the end of the 40 years, he hits the rock instead of speaking to it. And God says, "Well, because you did not trust me enough, you're going to miss out on the greatest reward that you have been waiting for." And I think that the same thing sometimes happens in our lives. Sometimes we're tempted to take matters back into our own hands, where we're scared to trust God enough when things get scarier and scarier, maybe even on the onset. And instead of doing that next risky thing, we go, well, wait, what worked before? Oh, yeah, I did that before. That seemed to work all right. Let me go back and do that again. Let me go back to where it's safe. I don't really want to change it. I want to go back to what I know works. And in that moment, we aren't trusting God. We're removing ourselves from the equation where God is using us to prove himself as trustworthy. And I think about the reward that Moses missed out on. And I think that if nothing else, the reward that we miss out on is an opportunity to see God work in our lives and through us, and to grow in our knowledge of this amazing, incredible God who we are serving. Where is God giving you an opportunity to prove him as trustworthy? Is it a health issue? Is it a marriage struggle? Is it kids that are rebelling? Is it some fear of the future? Is it a job situation? What is it? Where has God placed you in a point where you realize that you cannot handle it by yourself? If you're in that point, recognize that it is an opportunity to prove God as trustworthy. Now, I asked the musicians this morning, I pulled a little change up from what we have in the bulletin, but I asked the musicians and if they would come forward. I asked them to sing that song again, to play that song again, "'Tis So Sweet to Trust in Jesus." Because I really think that song, I just could not get the words of that song out of my mind as I was preparing this week. It just kept coming back over and over again as I kept thinking about this incredible God who we have been given the opportunity to trust. 'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus.